I'm Nathalie Biancheri, and I'm the writer and director of Wolf. I'd read about species dysphoria, which is kind of a growing phenomenon in which a person believes that they're an animal trapped in a human body. And I initially thought it could be an interesting documentary, but then I felt like I wanted to have the freedom to take this into a completely different sphere and use my imagination and, I suppose, reinvent what I found interesting about this real illness, which I think in the end has led this film to being much more a film about identity and how we define ourselves rather than necessarily sort of factually about species dysphoria. I found it sort of, fascinating that a person might believe that they're an animal trapped in a human body, and, where does that, if someone really, really feels that, does that become legitimate? And I imagined I started creating this world, which is the zoo, the clinic, in which the film is set, in which I imagine that there's a lot of these teenagers who perhaps don't quite feel really that they're an animal, but have different issues or personal quests or problems that have led them to identify with an animal as a form of escapism. And then one boy who really, really, really feels that he is a wolf, and how this kind of these different forms of relationship with this illness interact with each other. I mean, even is it an illness actually? Wolf is a story about a teenage boy, Jacob, who deeply, irrevocably believes that he is a wolf trapped in a human body. And he gets sort of sent, but also kind of wants to go and wants to get cured to this clinic, which has been nicknamed the zoo by the patients. But it's a clinic that cures species dysphoria and has patients who all believe that they're animals trapped in human bodies. It's set in a kind of world that is our own. In my vision for the film, it's certainly like our world and very familiar in many ways, but also sort of slightly removed and increasingly strange and bizarre as we progress through the film. Jacob kind of goes through a series of different therapies that are aimed to cure him, but they're terrible therapies. Essentially, it's in very much also a film about kind of how we try and repress or get people to conform and deny themselves effectively. And while some of these therapies do work on the other patients, because maybe some of the other patients, like there's a squirrel, there's a girl who thinks she's a parrot, maybe don't so much identify with their animals so deeply that they are able, in fact, to, let's say, remove themselves or admit that they're not an animal, or kind of succumb to this violent world in which they're forced to sort of renounce their projection. With Jacob, this can't work because it's just such an internal urgency. It's an instinct. Sort of the bulk of the film is him going through these therapies and finding solace, however, in a love story with another patient. I mean, a love story, a friendship story, a sort of story of momentary affinity, maybe is the best way to define it. She's a patient, but also has been there for years and years and years. She's called the Wildcat, and the two meet in the dead of night, and they find something, and I think he thinks for a moment that he can kind of perhaps renounce his wolfish self, or a life of loneliness or detachment from everything through her, with her. Jacob Wolf is a very mysterious character. I told George when I cast him that I didn't fully know this character until, then that this would be the discovery of the film, was to get to know who he was, and that we would have to find him together, because in a way he's certainly the lead character of the film, but he is also the most enigmatic, and I think, the one who has been fleshed out so much through a collaboration with George. He's obviously this boy who believes that he's a wolf, who feels it deeply, instinctively, who's trying to repress it, because in the end he loves his parents, has a certain attachment to normal life, doesn't want to end up alone, so is kind of very conflicted, but ultimately it's not really something renounceable when it's part of who you are. He's a silent, mysterious, but also like very present in many ways. He's so aware of everything that's going on around him, but doesn't express himself sort of traditionally with words. So I think he's a character which audiences might initially sometimes struggle with because he's just so closed off. But I think when you look into George's eyes and Jacob's eyes, you really can see so much of this pain and torment.